The woman died on a Tuesday morning, and nothing about it demanded attention. That later would be the problem. Martha Bellows was 78, widowed, and lived alone in a narrow house outside Norfolk, Nebraska, the kind of place that smelled faintly of boiled vegetables and furniture polish. She had no enemies, no inheritance disputes, no recent visitors worth remembering. The death certificate would list cardiac failure, complications related to age. It would be signed within 48 hours and filed without resistance. The body was discovered by a visiting nurse shortly after 9 a.m. Martha lay in her bed, hands folded over her stomach, hair brushed, nightgown clean. There were no signs of distress, no bruising, no overturned furniture. The window beside the bed was open exactly 3 inches. Even the room seemed prepared. A glass of water sat on the nightstand, untouched. Her medication tray was neatly arranged, pills missing in the correct order. The nurse would later say that Martha looked ready, as though she had known the moment was coming and had decided not to argue with it. By noon, the house was quiet again. By evening, it was already being forgotten. What no one noticed, what no one thought to question, was the timing. Martha had been lucid the night before. She had spoken with her neighbor about the weather. She had eaten dinner. She had complained mildly about stiffness in her hands. There had been no warning. But warning required expectation. And expectation required someone to believe that a death like this could be anything other than natural. 3 weeks later, 200 miles south, another woman died the same way. Same posture, same neatness, same calm absence of struggle. Different county, different nurse, different attending physician. Different explanation. If anyone had compared the files, they might have noticed the similarities in language, the way both nurses described the rooms, the way both doctors commented on how peaceful the deaths appeared. They might have noticed that in both cases, a temporary caregiver had been assigned shortly before death, a woman whose employment records were thin, whose references were polite but vague. They did not compare the files. They did not compare anything. The system, at the time, was not designed to connect quiet events. In the early 1960s, America worried about noise, about riots, about communism, about visible threats. Elderly women dying alone in small towns did not register as danger. They registered as closure. No autopsy was ordered. No investigation opened. The house was cleaned, the bed remade, the pills discarded. And the caregiver moved on. Her name in Nebraska records was Elena Pike. Age 41. Occupation, private home care aide. Marital status, single. Next of kin, none listed. She had been hired through a local church bulletin board, paid in cash, stayed 3 weeks, left without incident. By the time Martha Bellows was buried, Elena Pike was already in another state. And the pattern, though no one yet recognized it, had begun. Not with violence, not with blood, but with order, with care, with deaths so well behaved that no one thought to ask who had helped them happen. Elena Pike understood something most people never learned. If you wanted to move unnoticed, you didn't hide. You fit. She dressed plainly, skirts below the knee, soft blouses, sensible shoes. Her hair was always pinned back, her face unremarkable in a way that resisted memory. People struggled to describe her after meeting her, which Elena considered a skill. In employment records across Nebraska and South Dakota, her name appeared briefly and vanished just as easily. Temporary, reliable, quiet. Perfect. Elena had not planned to become a caregiver. She had drifted into the work after leaving St. Louis in 1957, following the collapse of a short, ill-considered marriage. With no children, no stable address, and no desire to explain herself, she discovered that caring for the elderly required 3 things she already possessed: patience, attention, and restraint. The work offered intimacy without permanence, and authority without challenge. Her first months passed without incident. She cooked, she cleaned, she listened. She learned routines quickly, medication schedules, habits, fears. She noticed how easily trust formed when someone felt themselves fading, how gratitude made people compliant, how doctors rarely questioned notes written in tidy handwriting by a woman who looked like responsibility itself. Elena did not rush. She watched. The first death was not Martha Bellows. It had been a man in South Dakota, a retired railroad worker with a weak heart and no family. Elena had been with him less than 2 weeks. When he died in his sleep, she felt something she had not expected. Not guilt, clarity. She had adjusted his medication timing, not dangerously, just enough. She had positioned the room carefully. She had prepared. When the doctor nodded and signed the form without lifting his eyes, Elena understood something essential. No one wanted complications. Martha Bellows was different because she was intentional. By the time Elena arrived at the narrow house outside Norfolk, she had already learned what questions not to ask. She never inquired about wills. She never mentioned loneliness. She let the house speak instead. Martha spoke freely once she felt safe. She talked about pain, about being tired, about how embarrassing it was to need help with simple things. Elena listened without interrupting, her hands folded, her expression calm. People mistook that calm for kindness. On the final morning, Elena woke early. She followed the routine exactly as Martha expected: warm water, clean linens, pills arranged correctly, almost correctly, the window opened just enough to let in cool air, the bed positioned comfortably. Nothing rushed, nothing forced. Elena stayed until the breathing slowed, then stopped. She did not cry. She did not hurry. She cleaned the room. Afterward, Elena packed carefully. She left no personal items behind, no fingerprints where they didn't belong, no changes to the house that would suggest intervention. When the visiting nurse arrived, Elena had already gone. The nurse would later describe the caregiver only as a nice woman. That description followed Elena Pike across state lines. It followed her into Iowa. And it followed her into a chance meeting, one she did not expect and could not control, that would change the nature of what she was doing forever. Because Elena was about to meet someone who did not just understand endings. She understood systems. Iowa did not feel different from Nebraska. That, Elena Pike thought, was its advantage. Small towns leaned into familiarity. Clerks remembered faces. Doctors trusted routines. Deaths arrived quietly and were processed quickly, especially when they came wrapped in age, fatigue, and relief. Elena found work outside Ottumwa, caring for Ruth Harvorson, a 72-year-old woman with arthritis, poor circulation, and a son who lived 3 states away and called once a month out of obligation. Ruth did not want a nurse. She wanted someone who would not argue with her. Elena was perfect. Ruth talked too much. She talked about her husband's death, about how long it had taken, about the indignity of machines, and whispered conversations outside hospital doors. She talked about how she feared dying loudly, how she wanted it to be simple. Elena listened. She always listened. But this time, something was different. For the first time, Elena did not feel like she was adjusting an outcome. She felt like she was being invited into it. The preparation took days. Elena reviewed Ruth's medications carefully. She made notes, not on paper, but in her head. She observed how the doctor responded to small changes in blood pressure, how easily he reassured himself. She tested boundaries. A delayed dose here, a substituted pill there, nothing dangerous, nothing immediate, just confirmation. The system behaved exactly as she expected. On a Thursday evening, Elena cooked dinner and sat with Ruth at the table. They talked about nothing important: the weather, a neighbor's dog, the way the house creaked at night. Later, Elena helped Ruth into bed. She brushed her hair. She adjusted the pillows. She placed Ruth's hands gently over her stomach. It was not violent. It was deliberate. Ruth died shortly before dawn. There was no struggle, no confusion. Her breathing slowed, then faded. Elena remained seated beside the bed until the room was still. When she checked the pulse and found nothing, she felt it again. Not excitement. Completion. The doctor arrived 2 hours later. He asked routine questions. Elena answered calmly. She mentioned Ruth's fatigue, her age, her declining appetite. The doctor nodded, already convinced. He signed the certificate. Elena handed over the house keys. She left that afternoon. This death mattered because it belonged to her. Not to circumstance, not to chance, to choice. For the first time, Elena understood that what she was doing could be repeated, not recklessly, not emotionally, but methodically. She could decide when something ended, and she could do it in a way that left no echo. 2 weeks later, in a county office in Iowa, a woman named Lucinda Morales reviewed a routine report and paused. She did not know why. The file was unremarkable: elderly woman, home care aide, natural causes. But the language bothered her. Too careful, too similar to something she had read before. Lucinda did not yet understand what she was looking at. But she understood one thing clearly: this death did not feel accidental. And Elena Pike, unaware that she had just crossed from invisibility into pattern, was already packing for her next assignment. The work she believed was still hers alone. She was wrong. Lucinda Morales had never intended to work in public health. She had wanted law school, then money ran out, then her father got sick, then life narrowed into practical shapes. By 1962, she worked as a records analyst for the Iowa Department of Health, reviewing death certificates for statistical consistency. It was not investigative work. That, she often thought, was why she was good at it. No one expected her to look closely. The Harvorsen file bothered her because of its tone. Doctors usually wrote with haste, abbreviations, shorthand, confidence bordering on indifference. This report was different. The phrasing was careful, almost rehearsed. The same phrases appeared in another file from 6 months earlier, and another. Different counties, different doctors. Same cadence. Lucinda began pulling records quietly during lunch breaks and after hours. She did not flag anything officially. She did not notify supervisors. She copied names into a small notebook she kept in her purse. 4 deaths. All elderly, all home care situations, all attended briefly by the same woman. Elena Pike. Lucinda searched employment registries and found very little. No long-term address, no tax records beyond minimal filings, church referrals, cash payments. Elena moved like a ghost between communities that never thought to compare notes. It was unsettling, but unsettling was not evidence. Lucinda needed more. She found it in Missouri. A death certificate from a town outside Poplar Bluff, filed just weeks after the Iowa case. Same posture described, same peaceful passing, same notation about medication compliance, written in handwriting that matched Elena's. Lucinda felt a chill she could not explain. This was no accident. This was repetition. What Lucinda did next changed the shape of the story. She did not contact law enforcement. She contacted Elena Pike. Under a false pretense. The letter was brief and polite, sent on official letterhead. Ms. Pike, we are reviewing caregiver practices across state lines. and would appreciate your input regarding patient care protocols. Your experience appears extensive. Lucinda included a return address and waited. Elena read the letter 3 times. Her first instinct was to ignore it. That had always worked before, but something about the wording unsettled her. It was too specific, too informed. Someone had noticed. Not enough to accuse. Enough to ask. Elena decided to respond. She always responded when systems reached out. They met in a diner off Highway 34. Lucinda arrived first. She chose a booth with a clear view of the door. Elena arrived exactly on time. She smiled easily. She ordered tea. She spoke with gentle authority about patient dignity and end-of-life care. She said all the right things. Lucinda listened and realized with absolute certainty that Elena Pike was not afraid. She was evaluating. "You've worked alone a long time," Lucinda said carefully. "Yes," Elena replied, "it's simpler that way." Lucinda nodded. "Doesn't it get lonely?" Elena paused. "Just a fraction too long." "Loneliness," she said, "is a matter of efficiency." Lucinda felt it then. Not fear. Recognition. What Elena did not know, what she could not yet see, was that Lucinda Morales was not trying to expose her. She was trying to understand her. Because Lucinda had been carrying a private thought for years, a quiet, forbidden one. That some deaths were not tragedies. They were corrections. And sitting across from Elena Pike, Lucinda realized she had finally found someone who might agree. The partnership had not yet formed, but the door had opened, and neither of them intended to close it. They did not speak of death at first. That would have been crude. Elena and Lucinda met twice more over the following month, always in public, always briefly. Coffee, lunch, a walk through a municipal park. Their conversations stayed technical, abstract, wrapped in language that sounded harmless to anyone listening too closely. Patient dignity, systemic failures, the inefficiency of prolonged decline. They spoke like professionals, like collaborators who had not yet admitted what they were collaborating on. Lucinda was the first to cross the line. Not in words, but in invitation. "There's a case in western Missouri," she said casually during their third meeting. "An elderly man, terminal. The family is exhausted. The county is understaffed." Elena said nothing. Lucinda continued. If someone were to assist with care, no one would question it. That was all. No instructions, no expectations. Just a door opened carefully. Elena understood immediately what was being offered. Not permission. Alignment. Lucinda was not asking Elena to act. She was signaling that if Elena did, someone would understand the paperwork. That was new, and dangerous, and irresistible. The man's name was Harold Keene, age 81, living outside West Plains, Missouri. He suffered from congestive heart failure and severe arthritis. His daughter lived nearby but worked 2 jobs. She welcomed help without scrutiny. Elena arrived on a Monday. Lucinda never visited the house. She didn't need to. Her role was not proximity. It was framing. The death followed the familiar pattern. Quiet, clean, timed for early morning. Medication records consistent enough to deflect suspicion, inconsistent enough to suggest decline. Harold Keene died on Thursday. Lucinda reviewed the certificate the following week. She adjusted nothing. That was the point. The system accepted it as complete. The second joint death came faster. Alma Vickers, Arkansas. 76. Diabetic. Lived alone. Lucinda flagged the case internally as high risk of complication, ensuring no one else would review it closely. Elena arrived 2 days later. Alma died in her sleep. No questions followed. By the third death, they had refined their roles. Elena handled the environment. Lucinda handled the narrative. They did not rush, they did not overreach. They selected cases where death already hovered close, where their intervention would be invisible, almost merciful. 3 deaths became 4. 4 became 6. Different states, different bodies. Same calm ending. They never celebrated. They never spoke of success. After each death, they met once, briefly, to confirm details. No notes, no souvenirs, no acknowledgement beyond confirmation that the system had accepted what it was given. What they shared was not friendship. It was precision. The danger came not from violence, but from confidence. Lucinda began to notice patterns beyond the deaths themselves, how often Elena's name appeared, how similar the language remained despite different doctors. She adjusted phrasing, spread responsibility, trained herself to dilute the trail. Elena trusted her. That, in hindsight, was the mistake. Because while Lucinda believed in systems, she also believed in observation. And somewhere between the 7th and 8th death, she realized something unsettling. Elena was no longer choosing necessary endings. She was choosing convenient ones. And convenience, Lucinda knew, was how patterns stopped hiding. The partnership still held, but a fracture had formed. And once systems crack, they do not forgive those who built them. The problem arrived disguised as paperwork. In Jefferson City, Missouri, a junior investigator named Thomas R. Hale was assigned to review a backlog of eldercare fatalities after a clerical audit flagged missing cross-county references. It was a bureaucratic task meant to close gaps, not open doors. Hale did not expect to find anything. He did not expect patterns. What caught his attention was not the deaths themselves. It was the language. Phrases repeated across counties that did not share reporting templates, identical descriptions of posture, the same careful emphasis on compliance and peaceful passing, different doctors, different handwriting. Same story. Hale began mapping caregiver involvement. Most cases dissolved quickly, agencies, rotating staff, incomplete logs. But one name appeared again and again, always briefly, always just before death. Elena Pike. Hale contacted county officers quietly. No alarms, no accusations. Just questions. Was Pike licensed? Sometimes. Was she paid in cash? Did anyone remember her clearly? Not really. What bothered him most was timing. Elena never stayed long enough to raise concern. She arrived late in a patient's decline and left immediately after death, always before questions formed. It looked deliberate. Hale escalated the file to the Missouri State Bureau. They declined. No evidence of foul play, no toxicology reports, no witnesses, elderly patients die. That was the system's position. Hale disagreed. So he did what systems fear most. He kept looking. Meanwhile, Lucinda Morales noticed the shift. A request came through her department asking for consolidated data on home care deaths across state lines. It was phrased neutrally, but Lucinda recognized it as the first ripple of scrutiny. Someone else had started to connect. She told Elena to pause. "Take time off," Lucinda said during a brief phone call. "Let things cool." Elena listened and ignored her. The next death occurred in southern Illinois. Beatrice Long, age 79, stroke history, lived with her sister. The sister left the house for errands one afternoon. Elena was alone with Beatrice for less than 2 hours. Beatrice died that night. Too fast, too clean. This time, an autopsy was ordered. Not because of Elena, but because Beatrice's sister asked for one. She was not suspicious. She was grieving. But grief opened a door that procedure had kept shut. The toxicology report was inconclusive, but not empty. Medication levels were within acceptable variance, yet inconsistent with the documented schedule, enough to raise a question, not enough to answer it. Hale received the report 2 weeks later. He added it to his growing file. 8 deaths, 5 states, 1 caregiver, and now something else. Lucinda saw the file request before it reached enforcement. She understood immediately what had happened. The system was no longer blind. She met Elena one final time in a park near the Des Moines River. "This is ending," Lucinda said. Elena shook her head. "It doesn't have to." Lucinda stood. "It already has." They did not argue. They did not embrace. They walked away in opposite directions, each believing, incorrectly, that separation would save them. What neither of them knew was that the case no longer belonged to either of them. It belonged to the state. And the state had finally learned where to look. Thomas Hale did not need a confession. He needed a contradiction. He found it in a shoebox. The box belonged to Beatrice Long. It sat beneath her bed, untouched during the first sweep of the house. Inside were appointment cards, old letters, and a handwritten medication log. Beatrice had kept herself neat, obsessive, dated down to the hour. Hale noticed something subtle. Beatrice's log showed she had taken her evening medication earlier than recorded on the official care notes. Not by much, 30 minutes, but enough to shift the entire timeline. Enough to mean someone else had been managing the schedule. Someone careful. Hale began rebuilding the deaths backward. Not from the certificates, but from homes, habits, and personal records no one had bothered to destroy because no one expected them to matter. In Iowa, a neighbor recalled a caregiver who insisted on opening windows for circulation, even in cool weather. In Arkansas, a pharmacist remembered a woman who asked precise questions about drug interactions, but never bought anything. In Missouri, a church volunteer mentioned that a caregiver always left immediately after a patient died, never staying for prayer. Individually, meaningless. Together, a silhouette. Elena Pike was located in Paducah, Kentucky, under a different referral name but the same pattern of employment. Hale alerted state police, not to arrest, but to observe. They watched for 3 days. Elena followed her routine perfectly. That was the problem. She adjusted nothing for being watched. Because she didn't know she was. Lucinda Morales made her mistake the same week. She altered a file. Just slightly. She corrected phrasing in a Missouri death certificate to improve consistency, a habit, an instinct, one she had indulged too often. Hale noticed the edit trail and realized the case had an inside voice. The net closed quietly. State police waited until Elena completed her assignment and attempted to leave town. She was stopped on the highway for a routine check. Her car contained nothing illegal. No drugs, no weapons. Just notebooks. The notebooks were not incriminating in isolation. No names, no dates, no explicit instructions. But patterns. Symbols, short phrases, arrows. A system of reminders only useful to someone managing decline. Someone like Elena. Lucinda was brought in the following morning. She did not resist. She asked only one question. "How many did you find?" The investigator did not answer. He didn't need to. Lucinda closed her eyes. They were charged separately. Interrogated separately. And for the first time since they met, Elena and Lucinda were forced to exist without the system they had built together. Elena said nothing. Lucinda spoke carefully. But silence, Hale understood, was not the absence of guilt. It was its most refined form. The case was no longer about whether deaths had occurred. It was about whether the law could explain how something so quiet had lasted so long, and whether a jury would accept that care itself had been used as a weapon. The trial would answer that. But first, the system would do what it always did when it finally caught up. It would document, it would label, and it would reduce two women to evidence. The evidence room smelled like dust and old paper. That was where the case finally became real. Not in the interrogation rooms, not in the arrest reports, but here, where quiet things were laid out and forced to explain themselves. Elena Pike's notebooks were the first problem. They were written in a private shorthand, but not a code. No encryption, no secrecy, just efficiency, symbols for medication classes, arrows indicating sequence, circles around certain times of day, margins filled with small observations, window, pulse, delay. A forensic nurse testified that the notes described how to slow a body without stopping it outright. Not poisoning, she said, gidding. The jury shifted in their seats. The second problem was Lucinda Morales. Not what she had done, but where she had done it. Prosecutors presented file change logs, internal memos, and testimony from clerks who remembered Lucinda helping with phrasing. She had never falsified a cause of death outright. She had standardized it, smoothed language, reduced anomalies. She made deaths look normal. That was her crime. The defense tried sympathy. They described Elena as a lonely woman who misunderstood boundaries. They described Lucinda as a bureaucrat overwhelmed by responsibility. They emphasized the absence of violence. No bruises, no weapons, no struggle. Where is the murder? The defense asked. The prosecution answered by laying out 7 objects on a table. A pill organizer, a handwritten log, a window latch, a clean bedsheet, a clock reset backward by 30 minutes, a church referral slip, a state file marked reviewed. Here, the prosecutor said, this is where it lives. Families testified reluctantly. They did not want revenge. They wanted certainty. One daughter said her mother had been afraid of dying alone and now wondered whether that fear had been used against her. A son admitted he had felt relief when his father passed peacefully and now questioned whether that relief had been engineered. The courtroom did not erupt. It absorbed. Elena was offered a plea. She refused. I didn't kill them, she said calmly. I was there when they stopped. Lucinda was offered the same. She hesitated longer, then declined. If the system worked, she said, none of you would be here. The trial lasted 6 weeks. By the end, the jury no longer asked whether the women had caused the deaths. They asked whether anyone else had noticed. And that question lingered heavier than guilt. Because the answer was no. The verdict would come soon. And with it, the state's final attempt to define something it had never learned how to see. The jury deliberated for 14 hours. There were no raised voices reported, no dramatic walkouts, just long silences interrupted by rereading transcripts and passing around copies of Elena Pike's notebooks like fragile artifacts. The question was not did they act. It was did intent exist. The foreman spoke first when they returned. His voice was steady. On all counts of interstate homicide, conspiracy, and obstruction of public records, the jury found Elena Pike guilty. Lucinda Morales was found guilty on conspiracy and obstruction, but acquitted on 2 homicide counts where causation could not be legally proven. It did not feel like compromise. It felt like precision. Sentencing followed a week later. The prosecution argued that Alina had acted as the instrument, direct, intentional, repeatable, that without her physical presence, the deaths would not have occurred when they did. The defense argued mercy, age isolation, the absence of force. The judge listened without expression. Under Missouri law, the sentence was mandatory. Death by lethal injection. Alina did not react. Lucinda's sentencing was more complex. The courtroom heard arguments about responsibility without touch, about whether shaping narrative was equivalent to shaping outcome, about how much harm could be done by someone who never entered a room where a body lay. Lucinda stood when asked if she wished to speak. She did not apologize. "I did not invent the system," she said. "I learned how it worked." She was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Some in the gallery sighed with relief. Others looked away. The appeals process stretched for years. Alina remained silent throughout. She declined interviews. She wrote no letters. Psychiatrists described her as internally resolved. Lucinda filed motions endlessly, challenging procedures, definitions, standards. Most were denied. A few altered language, none altered outcome. They were never housed together. They were never allowed contact. The partnership was erased by policy. In 1974, Alina Pike's final appeal was denied. The execution date was set. Lucinda was notified by memo. She read it twice, folded the paper carefully, and placed it inside a law book she never finished reading. The public response was muted. No protests, no documentaries, no books rushed to print. 2 women who killed quietly did not fit the stories people wanted to tell about violence. And so the state prepared to finish what it had started, without spectacle, without ceremony, and without reflection. Only one part remained: the ending. And what, if anything, would remain after it? Alina Pike was executed on a Monday morning in May of 1976. The timing was deliberate. Executions scheduled early in the week attracted less attention, fewer reporters, fewer visitors, fewer reasons for the public to look too closely. Alina declined a final meal. She declined spiritual counsel. When asked if she wished to make a statement, she said only, "I kept things from becoming worse." At 6:12 a.m., the injection began. At 6:19 a.m., Alina Pike was pronounced dead. The room was silent. No one applauded. No one cried. Lucinda Morales learned of the execution from a guard who did not know her name. She acknowledged it with a nod and returned to her cell. That evening, she requested writing materials and drafted a letter she never sent. It contained no confessions, no explanations, only a list of dates and places, states she would never see again. The prison psychiatrist later described her reaction as administrative grief. She had not lost a friend. She had lost a system. In the years that followed, the case faded. There were no sweeping reforms, no new oversight committees with real authority. Training manuals were updated with vague language about caregiver accountability, then quietly ignored. The state archived the files. The notebooks were destroyed after appeal deadlines expired. Lucinda's edited documents remained in circulation, clean, standardized, indistinguishable from thousands of others. The system corrected nothing. Families remembered differently. Some chose to believe the deaths had been natural after all. Others carried a private suspicion they could never prove. A few stopped trusting caregivers entirely. Most did what people always do. They moved on. Lucinda Morales died in prison in 1989 from complications related to untreated hypertension. There was no investigation, no review, no note of irony in the report. Cause of death, natural. Today, the names Elena Pike and Lucinda Morales appear only in a handful of legal summaries and footnotes. Their case is taught briefly in ethics seminars, usually as a warning about oversight and language. Rarely about intent. Never about how easily care can become control. Because the most unsettling truth of the story was never the number of deaths. It was how little resistance there had been. How smoothly the machinery accepted what it was given. How quietly the endings were processed. How order itself had done most of the work. And long after the files were closed, long after the women were gone, the system continued, unchanged, efficient, and uncurious. Waiting for the next quiet correction no one would think to question.